Good morning or early afternoon, folks. I'm going to give everybody just a minute to log in, and then we get started. We've got lots of people on the line. Just want to give everyone a chance to get logged on, and then we will get started. We'll be back in 1 minute. Okay, everyone, welcome. I'm Tim Richter. I'm the president of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today on the homelessness prevention and housing benefit, and more particularly on some polling that we've done with Nik Nanos from Nanos Research, who has joined us today. So we will get started. I wanted to start, first of all, with a land acknowledgement, and from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Métis, all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We recognize the historic and ongoing impact of colonization and are committed to decolonization of our systems and ongoing reconciliation, guided in our work by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice, and the principles of empowerment and self-determination. I am happy to be speaking to you from Treaty 7 in Calgary, which is home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation, Region 3, and all people who make Treaty 7 Region of Southern Alberta home. So with that, I would like to just give you a little bit of history. So those of you who aren't familiar, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness works in 6 really key areas. We do, as you'll see today, we'll talk a bit about some of our advocacy work, but we also work with a network of allied networks that have elements of ending homelessness, and we partner with on advocacy and equipping communities with some of the tools and training they need to be successful. We also run Built for Zero Canada, who works with 40 communities that are committed to ending chronic and or veteran homelessness. We also are actively working to revolutionize the way communities and governments use data to end homelessness. Many of you will have joined us at our national conference on ending homelessness. The next one is coming to Halifax, Nova Scotia, November 8th to 10th, 2023. And we also have our training and technical assistance program. Today's webinar is going to really focus on, I want to just jump right into talking about the wave of new homelessness we're seeing and the homelessness prevention and housing benefit proposal we've put forward. But I want to dedicate most of our time today to hear from Nik Nanos at Nanos Research. And then I'll turn things over to my colleague, Andrew Burns, who's going to talk to you a bit about how to take action in support, and we'll do a bit of time for a moderated Q&A. So just a bit of housekeeping. We've got a lot of people on the line today. Over 400 folks have registered for this webinar. It's great to see such a strong response in a short period of time, which tells us a lot about how folks are feeling in the community and the urgency to tackle this wave of new homelessness we're seeing, and how we need to get after some policy in order to do that. But because there's so many people, we have everybody muted. Please feel free to chat. Let us know where you're calling in from, where you're joining us from. Feel free to chat with your colleagues using the chat feature. As I mentioned, we'll have a moderated Q&A. So feel free to, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and when we get to our Q&A period, I'll be asking questions from that panel. May have trouble following everything in the chat, so do please put it into the Q&A and we'll go there. And we will have a recording available that we'll post on our website and circulate to folks via email as well. So really quickly, as you all know, and you will see better, I think, than we will on the line, that Canada is experiencing a wave of new homelessness that's driven by the ongoing impact of the pandemic, but really accelerated by the cost of living crisis. And we were talking just before we all joined, and Nik was saying that this is another very traumatic period for folks, and we see that playing out in food bank use hitting record levels, and we know that food bank use is a kind of a distant early warning, or not so distant early warning, of a wave of new homelessness. But you're seeing it anecdotally, you're seeing it in your data, you're seeing it on the ground, and some of you may be experiencing it. But when we looked at just a sample of our communities, of 14 communities that have quality real-time data from before the pandemic in February 2020 and compared it to October 22, 79% of those 14 communities saw increases in chronic homelessness, not all homelessness, just chronic homelessness. So people that have been homeless more than 6 months or have repeated episodes of homelessness over 18 months or during a longer period of time. But we saw increases averaging 34%. So that tells you that there is a significant wave of new homelessness across the country, and we have no reason to believe that these levels that we took in that sample are any different than other communities, large and small, in urban and rural centers around the country. So to address this wave of homelessness, we spent a lot of time trying to think about and talking to people about, well, what can we really do? Like, what measure would stop a wave of new homelessness like the one we're seeing? And as we explored different options, it became really apparent that really the only tool we have in the short term, not in the long term, but in the short term, to slow or stop this wave of new homelessness is a homelessness prevention and housing benefit, an income-based targeted benefit to provide immediate financial relief to low-income Canadians and people experiencing homelessness. In a nutshell, so you'll all get a copy of these slides, or you'll be able to access them online. So you can click through the links, you can go to visit our site, get more details. But essentially, the benefits that the homelessness prevention housing benefit we're proposing has two parts. The first part is 50,000 benefits, or benefits to provide exits to homelessness for 50,000 plus people, and provide rental relief like you do in a housing first program, probably wraparound supports. But this is really focused on just that rental support to accelerate movement out of homelessness and provide some relief to communities. Certainly not enough to eliminate homelessness, may not even be enough to create significant reductions, but certainly enough to relieve the pressure on the homeless system and move people out more rapidly. And the larger component is a proposal to provide direct rental relief through Canada Revenue Agency, for example, to up to 385 households in the deepest core housing need, and who we believe are representative of those people who are most likely to experience homelessness. And the aim of a housing benefit is to bridge the gap between current income or benefit levels and the actual cost of rented housing, not for homeowners, for rented housing. And to our knowledge, it is the only immediate, cost-effective and targeted option available to slow or stop a wave of new homelessness we're experiencing today. Housing options required to address this problem couldn't be delivered fast enough or at the scale needed to be effective. As I mentioned, there are two streams. The first is one targeting chronic homelessness, the second, or targeting homelessness and chronic homelessness. And the second is an option for up to 385,000 households. We suggested that there's two different options. You can have a shallower subsidy to fewer people giving the government an option for a lower cost option that should still be effective, but wanting to aim for a larger catchment of people with that 385,000 in deepest core housing need. So, why use income support versus housing? Well, first of all, 75% of households in core housing need have suitable and adequate housing they can afford. 85% of people experiencing homelessness are only homeless due to poverty and a lack of affordable housing. And there's tons of research in Canada that shows that even people experiencing homelessness with a relatively shallow subsidy, you could dramatically reduce emergency shelter use. We do, and I really want to highlight this point. Canada's in a housing crisis that's 30 years in the making. We have a desperate need for more deeply affordable housing, but the government can't possibly deliver enough housing quickly enough to stop this new wave of homelessness, and only rental benefits can do that. This approach is based on evidence. So here's a few examples from Canada, the At-Home Chez Soi project, a paper done, also a paper done by Jeff Nelson and Tim Aubrey on portable housing benefits as an indispensable component of ending homelessness. As well, there's a couple of studies here from the United States, a family options study and a book called In the Midst of Plenty that document this need. But importantly, this is an approach we know has worked. The United States faces very similar challenges to we have, but interestingly, in the United States, eviction rates have been kept at pre-pandemic levels using rent supports similar to what we're proposing in our homelessness prevention and housing benefit. And during the pandemic, the CERB program, which is targeted only to people who were working, right? The CERB program reduced core housing need in Canada by at least 200,000 households, right? So we know that these income-based measures can be effective. And we don't want to, I think it's also important that we note the scale of the crisis that we're facing. Homelessness today is already at the same scale as the largest natural disasters in Canadian history in terms of the loss of housing and the number of people impacted and the economic impact. We also know that if we were to look at the top disasters in Canadian history with significant loss of life, homelessness as it is today, and it has evolved over the last 30 years, would easily rank as one of the top 5 most lethal disasters in Canadian history, right? It already costs the economy over $7 billion a year and affects at least 235 different people, and that is based on estimates from 2016, right? So that's years old estimates, and we know the number is higher. So it'll only get worse if we don't act now, but we know, and you know, that it doesn't need to be this way. Right, so I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to pass it over to my friend Nik Nanos. Nik leads Nanos Research, is one of the foremost pollsters in Canada, and somebody that I know our friends in Ottawa pay very close attention to, as do I. And I will happily turn it over to Nik to talk about the results of the poll that we commissioned from him a couple of weeks ago. Nik, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Tim, and I'm happy to join everyone to share the latest views of Canadians on housing and homelessness. And what's interesting is that to Tim's point, this is a significant problem. It's pretty clear that people want concrete action, and I think it's sad to say that I think when you look at some of these numbers, it doesn't look like things are moving in the right direction. And, if we thought that we had a sense of urgency a year, 2, 3 years ago, that's even compounded now, just looking at these numbers and, based on what Tim has just mentioned. So I'm going to unpack a few things. We're going to talk about the change in the number of people experiencing homelessness, how people land. Tim talked about a proposal for a new benefit, what Canadians think of the proposal that's being advanced by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. We'll also talk about the kind of how much of a priority or level of importance it is to fight homelessness. And we're going to talk about how many Canadians are worried about paying for housing costs in the next month. And, Tim talked about the organizations that they consulted, that the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness consulted to kind of get an idea of what I'll say the temperature and the direction on homelessness. And, this particular data point for this national survey that we completed, and Tim said this is like only 2 weeks old. You can see that the survey was just completed at the very end of January. So it's a national representative survey, and it's accurate 3.1 percentage points, 19 times out of 20. But, check out the numbers. Now, do you notice how the green is such a small sliver? Like, one of the slivers was so small that it could not even be reported in terms of whether it was decreasing to one extent or another. The clear takeaway is that a significant proportion of Canadians believe that it is increasing to one extent or another. Basically 3 out of every 4. If you happen to be in British Columbia, when you look at some of these regional breaks, you're probably more likely to say that the proportion of people experiencing homelessness is on the increase. So just to put this into context, if we're walking in our local neighborhood and we walk past 100 people, only one actually thinks that it's actually getting better out of 100. So think of it that way. Next time you're out grocery shopping or kind of out in your neighborhood and with your neighbors, no one, for all intents and purposes, believes that things are getting better on the whole concept of the proportion or the number of people that are experiencing homelessness. And so what's interesting is that when we test on this whole concept that Tim and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness put on the table for the introduction of a new benefit paid for by the federal government, you can see that 7 out of every 10 Canadians are likely to support or somewhat support introducing something like this. The other thing that's actually quite striking is that women are much more likely to identify support for a measure like this compared to men. But we shouldn't say that men are not supportive, because the fact of the matter is that 63% of men still support this. And the reality is, when you look across basically all of the demographic groups and the regions, that there's a significant level of support based on gender, age, and geography, support for introducing a new benefit in order to help low-income Canadians pay the rent to prevent them from being homeless. And the other thing is that's quite striking is that when it comes to the importance, and I always look at the people that rate something important versus not important, and we have to remember that there are a lot of competing priorities such as healthcare, the economy and jobs, the environment and stuff like this. But what you can see is that people are 3 times more likely to say that it is important rather than not important to fund programs to fight homelessness. So that's definitely on the radar for many Canadians. Now, worry about paying for housing costs. This is the trend, and this speaks to what Tim mentioned in the outreach that this Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness did. And back in 2020, we had a benchmark for the work that we did cooperatively with the CAEH, and back then, 16% said that they were worried or somewhat worried about paying housing costs in the next month. And I remember back then when Tim and I did the webinar, we go, that's not good. That's, we should be very worried that such a significant proportion of Canadians. Well, I'm sad to report that right now, the numbers have gone up. It's gone from 16%, you can see, to 24%, a 9-point increase just from 2020. And the other thing is that, we talked about that. I talked about that other stat, walking in your neighborhood and walking past 100 neighbors and only one thinks that things are getting better on homelessness. Well, think of it this way. When we're walking in our neighborhood, 1 out of every 4 of our neighbors, 24%, are worried about just being able to pay the housing costs in the next 30 days. So not only is this seen as being a significant problem, not only do people want to see action, there's a sense of immediacy that we have not seen before, an urgency in terms of people being under stress when it comes to paying for their housing costs. The other thing, we talk about generations, check out the age break. Even 14% of Canadians that are over 55 years of age are worried about paying the rent to one extent or another. But check out the numbers for middle-aged and younger Canadians. You can see that basically 3 out of every 10 individuals in those two demographic cohorts are worried or somewhat worried about paying the rent in the next 30 days. So there's a significant generational divide. But you know what? If you're over 55 years of age, you're not immune, right? Still, you're at 14%. So where does that leave us? And I'm going to finish off with thank you. So, and actually the thank you is not for your attention, but thank you for the work that you're doing on this really important issue. But, the key takeaways here. No one believes that it's getting better. People want to see concrete action. They want to see support for people to help them pay for housing. And it's getting worse. If we thought it was bad in 2020, right now, according to what people are reporting, it is getting worse in terms of the proportion of Canadians that are worried about just paying for the rent in the next 30 days. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it back over to you, Tim and Andrew.
I'm going to mess with the agenda a little bit and just see if there's questions for Nik specifically on the polling. I have one question here from Stephen, who's saying, of the issues that you've been asked to poll in the last 3 years, where does homelessness rank as an issue for Canadians versus things like healthcare and climate change?
So what we've seen in the last number of years is focus on, and this is kind of like, and this might sound weird. So my wife and I have 4 kids. This is like, I love them all. They're all really important, but sometimes there's a different focus on each one of them. Like at the beginning before the pandemic, environment was actually the top worry that people had. The pandemic knocked environment off of the table. And then what we have seen is 2 things happen. People increasingly worried about healthcare, but we've also seen, I call it homelessness, worry about affordability, living, the rising cost of living, and specifically housing affordability, all kind of creep up. It's kind of like, it's like the undertone of something that is noticeably, a little bit at a time, increasing in importance. And the thing is asking people to rate the importance of homelessness compared to other issues is like saying, okay, so am I more worried about paying for the groceries or paying for the rent? Or am I more worried about whether my mother can get her hip replaced, or whether if I show up to the emergency room, whether it's open or not? So 2 things to look at. It is on the agenda, on the radar, from an unprompted national issue of concern. However, when we test specifically on this, it's basically, can I tell you something? There are very few issues that 99% of Canadians agree on. It looks like 99% of Canadians know that this is a problem. Even on a lot of these other issues, there's 10, 15% that say, you know what, the environment, not an issue. Jobs, the economy is going fine. I think I would be comfortable in saying there is a consensus in Canada that this is a problem. And that this problem doesn't necessarily affect everyone, but people recognize that more and more people are getting squeezed when it comes to just trying to manage the cost of housing.
Were there any, when you looked at this data, do you have the rest of your data kind of in the back of your mind? Were there any surprises for you in this?
Well, I think one of the surprises for me is generational. We tend to, the fact that young people feel just as stressed about paying for housing as middle-aged people is almost counterintuitive. Like, you'd think that if you're like middle-aged, that you're actually worried about other things other than paying for housing. And the one thing that's actually quite surprised me is that it's young people that are worried about paying for housing. Middle-aged people are worried about paying for housing. And I would also hazard to say that in the past, that under different circumstances, middle-aged people were not necessarily as worried about paying for the rent or paying for housing compared to what they are right now. And I think that's the most surprising thing, because you'd think that middle-aged people would be hypothetically the most economically stable, ones with a track record, and like, to say that young people might have more stress with housing is understandable. But I think the fact that middle-aged Canadians who are at the earning prime of their life are still reporting, 3 out of every 10 are reporting that they will probably struggle to just pay for housing in the next 30 days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm here in Alberta, and I remember in 2008, one of the things that moved the provincial government of Alberta to commit to ending homelessness was the fact that everybody knew somebody who was feeling that kind of housing stress, and it was trending up, and people were seeing and experiencing homelessness in a way that we weren't ever familiar with before. And it feels like we may be getting into that space. And there's a question here where an anonymous attendee is asking, do you think those who are fully housed and comfortable understand the impact of homelessness on their own lives?
Well, in some of the other research, Tim, that we did with you folks in the past, I think one of the things that was quite striking is, I'll call it, whenever we do research, we talk about the proximity effect, right? How close are you to the issue? So, at one end of the spectrum would be individuals who are homeless or who have been homeless at one point in time in their lives. And then it would be like family, people in the family who's had other family members who have been homeless. I was really quite struck by the proportion of Canadians who either had reported at one time they were homeless, had a family member that was homeless, or a friend or a close acquaintance that was homeless. So this is not some kind of pie in the sky hypothetical problem for other people. It's actually very relevant for a significant proportion of the population.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'm just looking quickly. I guess another question from David, and it wasn't in this poll, David, but Nik may have some insight. Did you poll people, or have you polled people with regards to their views on encampments?
No, but I think as soon as you say the word encampment, that kind of says it all, right? I think for a lot of Canadians, when you think of it this way, Canadians have a certain self-image of the country and us as a society, right? That we are pragmatic, that we care about our neighbors, and I think for a lot of Canadians, I think for many of them, they just can't understand that in a country like Canada, how is it that we not only have homelessness, but that it's getting worse. I think that's so I think when it came to the idea of an encampment, I think Canadians who are not public policy experts, right, they don't that's all they know is that there's a problem, and that's all they know is that they want a solution. And just the mere fact that we're having a discussion about encampments would probably, for some Canadians wonder, are we really at that point? And why do we have to wait for it to get to that point before we actually act? So I think that's how that would probably be taken.
Yeah. Do you think we're seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like we're seeing more and more public concern around, public safety, or whether term social disorder concerns. Would you say some of that is kind of tangled up in the same issue? Absolutely.
And we just did some research last month also on people's perceptions, just like taking public transit. Like, do you feel safe when you take public transit? And there's a noticeable proportion of Canadians who take public transit that just basically don't feel safe. setting aside the fact that there's an increasing number of Canadians who feel unsafe in their neighborhoods. And I think when you compact anxiety about public safety, and then rising concern about potentially being homeless, it's like a double whammy. And why don't we just add on, people struggling just to pay for groceries, and in the research that we have, I found, what we found is that there are some young people who are cutting back on how much they're spending on groceries, because they're trying to reconcile the rising cost of housing with just basically food.
If you, so knowing what you know about opinion in Canada, what do you think would compel Canadians to vote on this issue?
Oh, now you're not going to like what I'm going to say, Tim. It would take a crisis. This goes back to what I said before. It would take a real crisis. That's sadly, it's kind of like the environment. It takes a crisis in the environment to mobilize people. It would take a crisis in homelessness. The sad part is that there are organizations like the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness that are saying that there is a crisis, but politicians have not acted yet. So, the thing is, we have to drive home. And, I think the most important message to say is to say, this was a problem before, and it's getting worse. So why don't we talk about just trying to slow down homelessness and slow down the stress that 1 out of every 4 Canadians are under when it comes to paying for housing. Let's start off with that. So I would hazard to say, this isn't, if we use a hospital analogy, this isn't about saving the patient and curing the patient. Actually, right now, it's about trying to stabilize things, because things are moving in the wrong direction. And the trend line suggests that more and more Canadians are worried about just paying for housing in the next 30 days.
Awesome. Tom has a question here saying, how well do you think Canadians understand the huge financial cost to society of homelessness?
I'm not sure they understand that, Tom. It's just one of those things where I think people can see the problem. They can see that it's not getting better. And, I think to Tom's point, maybe one of the things to talk about, because, all governments have different competing spending priorities, the cost of the program versus the cost of more and more people being homeless, but it's a sad part that, we have to have one has to have a argument that makes homeless a ledger entry in kind of in a Venetian accounting book, right? Where you have to kind of say, well, you know what, if you do this, then, when you think of the total cost of homelessness, this is why you should do it. Now, perhaps that's needed for some legislators and some governments, but I think the reality is, we should be talking, in addition to stabilizing the patient today, there needs to be a discussion on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in terms of and housing, and where we want to be as a country, and then to incrementally move towards something like that.
Awesome. There's a question from Kyler who is asking more about the white paper, the benefit proposal itself, and is asking, just curious why the proposal took an average income assistance estimate for affordability gaps rather than using the actual amounts, especially since that information was President Maitre's proposed Canada Worker Benefit expansion. Honestly, Kyler, it really just came down to what we could afford to do in the time that we had. I would have loved to dig down in much more detail, and in fact, the benefit, when implemented, will have to be geared, like the actual income and the actual rent would have to be calculated, right? So it's trying to bridge the gap between your income and the rent you're paying. So in implementation, we would absolutely have to do that. So would have loved, with more time and more money, to have been able to dig a lot deeper and be more specific, but we just had to do what we can with what we had. Right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to just leave the Q&A open for a bit. If you can hang out, we're just going to, I'll invite my colleague, Andrew, to jump in here, and I'll share my screen again. Andrew is our new Director of Communications and Marketing and Campaign Manager for Vote Housing. And I'll let him jump in on what's next.
Thanks so much, Tim. So first of all, I'm joining from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, which is now known as Vancouver, and really thrilled to be here today to talk a little bit more about what you can do to support this campaign. And after I go through this, I might ask Tim to talk a little bit about where he sees the campaign as at with the federal government and their responses. But many of you have already taken action, which has been really important. We've received some great messages back from MPs and ministers, and that shows that they're receptive to our proposal. So the first thing we ask people to do, if they haven't already, is to write to their local MP and key ministers. So that's the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Minister of Housing, and ask them to implement it. So you can take action on our website at action.caeh.ca/HPHB. I'll post these in the chat when I finish talking as well. And we really encourage you to tell your own story. Story is the most important way of convincing people of anything. And while we do provide a draft template letter, telling your own story, if you have one to share about your own experience as a lived expert on homelessness, or about your own experience of housing insecurity, or any experience that you might have, will be hugely impactful. We've also launched another action, writing to the leaders of the other major parties, so Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre, asking them to pressure the federal Liberals into putting this into their budget. And again, if you have a story to tell, it's another great opportunity to tell them your story too. We'll be sending out another action later today after this to share these poll results with your MP and key ministers as well, because it's really important that they understand just how much of the Canadian public really supports this. Politicians are responsive to public opinion, and we know that now that overwhelmingly Canadians support this. And the last ask for individuals is, if you can, and if you cannot, no pressure at all, but donate to fund our campaign. We are launching ads in the coming weeks to persuade Canadians and decision makers in Ottawa of the importance of this campaign and this proposal, and any financial support you're able to provide is greatly received and will help us get our message in front of more people. Tim, do you mind going to the next slide? So, of course, many communities and organizations and service providers are joining us on this call today as well. So we really wanted to encourage you to get involved too. So how can you do that as an organization? So first of all is sharing stories about how this proposal might impact members of your community. Writing to the relevant ministers from your organization endorsing the proposal. The formal budget consultation did finish on Friday last week, but that certainly does not preclude sending a letter on behalf of your organization. And that may include, working with your council if you're a municipality, or your mayor to endorse that too. Or if you are a councillor or the mayor of your municipality, please write, and feel free to get in touch with us about how we might support you to do that. I would really encourage you to share the proposal and our online actions with any email lists and your social media following, so really amplify the impact of our campaign. You can also write an op-ed in support of the proposal. And if you are an organization that's engaged in directly with your MP or a relevant minister, regardless of what party they're in, please bring this topic up as well. It is really critical that we are all working together on this. And probably about next week, we'll also be sending out a supporter pack with a lot more support and information about what you can do and resources. We're just building the plane while flying it with this campaign as we work really quickly and really hard to get this campaign and this proposal implemented.
Just want to underline something that Andrew said, and you look at all of the research in the lobbying and advocacy world, and The most powerful advocacy tool and the most effective way to change a politician's mind is a personal contact, is a phone call or a visit to their constituency office. Now, not everybody is comfortable doing that. I totally get it. But a phone call to your member of parliament, a phone call to your to a cabinet minister, or even a phone call to the prime minister's office, all of these things are counted and tracked. And we know that from decades of research that that personal contact and hearing from constituents is very, very, very effective. When we're filling up inboxes, right? We've sent thousands of letters to every member of parliament, to the Minister of Finance, to the opposition leaders, to the housing minister, and we're going to keep doing that, and that works too. But the more MPs hear from you directly, the more influence this campaign will have, and you will have. Yeah, and just to build off of Andrew, I don't want to jump all over you. Was there anything else you wanted to add before we jump to?
No, I was going to ask whether you wanted to share a bit of an update on where you see where we're at, though.
Yeah, so I think I'll be brutally honest and tell you that this is a long shot. We're asking the federal government to commit up to $3 billion per year. We all know that it is cheaper and more effective, and we all know the catastrophic toll that homelessness is taking on people's lives. But it is still the ink isn't dry on the budget yet, but they're filling out the pages and the ink is drying, right? So time is not in our favor, as somebody has alluded to, some of the competing priorities that the government faces. The government, what I'm hearing, they're saying we spent an awful lot of money in the first number of years of our mandate, which leaves us with not a lot of room left. Also, they're concerned about the impact that increased spending could have on inflation. We all know, and I think if there's any economists on the line, they'll probably agree that an investment in lower income households will have zero impact on inflation. So that argument doesn't really hold water, which really comes down to priorities. Priorities comes down to opinion and pressure, right? Homelessness, modern mass homelessness was created because there was nobody going to stop the federal government from cutting investment in affordable housing. Nobody, right? Because the people on this line, the people we represent, are largely powerless, right? To be brutally honest. But as Nik alluded to before, 35% of Canadians either know somebody who's experienced homelessness or has experienced it themselves. If those folks were organized, even a small portion of those folks were organized, and were demanding federal government take action, then the federal government would, right? So our long-term aim as the Canadian Alliance, and our long-term aim with our partners in Vote Housing, is to build political power for our movement, and most importantly, build political power for people experiencing homelessness and the people who love and care for them, right? That's our aim, because ultimately, in order to fix homelessness, you got to fix the policy that created it. But we have an emergency right here and now, and this problem is getting worse quickly. And we know that if we're able to get this kind of income support in place, we can slow or stop the wave of new homelessness. All the evidence in the world suggests it, and recent experience in the United States shows it, and recent experience in Canada demonstrates it. So we need you to write your MPs. We need you to make phone calls. We need you to tell your friends and get your friends doing these things as well. And the more of us doing that, we build the political power of this movement, and we can change the policy that created homelessness. We can reverse it and we can solve it. I'm going to just pause because I know there's a couple of other questions that have come in, quite a few other questions that have come in. I'll be really quick. Cassandra is asking, are these programs going to make it easier for home ownership for low-income Canadians? No, this is not targeted toward home ownership. This is actually specifically targeted toward rental. Not to say that home ownership for low-income Canadians is a bad idea. This is specifically targeted just at preventing more people from becoming homeless, so targeted at those who we think are likely at greatest risk. Brian is asking, most if not all politicians see homelessness as an issue and competing with many others for funding and don't see it as a foundational income and poverty issue that can, if properly addressed, solve many of the health issues such as hallway medicine. How do we get decision makers to think beyond 4-year election cycles to implement upstream strategies via education and public health? Well, I think it's two parts. One is we work on the policy and make those arguments, but again, it comes back to having political power, so that when they see they have to weigh multiple priorities, they see an army of people behind this particular priority and will put their vote and their money there. Margaret Foe is asking, hello Margaret, and by the way, amazing work on urban Indigenous housing. And some really amazing progress. From an Indigenous focus, Margaret is saying, we are negotiating with the feds for the remaining $281.5 million for an urban Indigenous 2022 allocation. I wonder how a benefit like this could be stacked or used for a program that addresses urgent and unmet Indigenous housing needs. That is exactly what it could do. So the idea would be that this could be a stackable benefit. So for example, you could use it if you're in core housing need, but in social housing, or you could stack it with other supports. So for example, if you were to create a housing program for Indigenous people, you could use the benefit, one of the 50,000 benefits allocated through Reaching Home to support those folks in their housing. Thank you for the question. Stephen's asking, in November 22, the Auditor General published a report pointing out how much money Infrastructure Canada has spent on housing, but could not say where or how. Is anyone using that report as leverage to get clarity on where the money went and get input on where future expenditures will go? Yes. The short answer is yes, absolutely. I also moonlight as the co-chair of the National Housing Council, and I can say with absolute certainty that the Auditor General's report is put under the nose of CMHC, Infrastructure Canada, and the government at every opportunity, and watch for some more information coming out of the council shortly. Will these letters, will the minister read the letter or will it be their staff? Both. So I know that every minister is a little bit different, but I know that ministers get summaries of all of the information that comes to them. They're going to see a similar letter come from lots of us, so they're going to get a report on that. Not only are they going to get a report on what's in the letter and what the request is in the letter, but they're going to get a report on how many people have reached out. I also know that lots of ministers, and I know ministers that we have been working with, do pay close attention to their Twitter feeds and their Facebook pages. And so they're watching what people are saying. Elizabeth is asking, is there there's a danger that the money will just go straight to landlords, make them richer and do nothing for tenants? How to prevent this? By making this a portable housing benefit that goes to the individual, to the tenant, and not the landlord. Therefore, it's invisible to the landlord. Administered through CRA, it would go directly to the individual, as would, you know, your GST rebate or that $500 a month check, that the rent top up that the government is working with. And sorry, I'm just looking through here. Can you build it? Tom is asking, can you build a simple business case which demonstrates how much investment in homelessness prevention saves tax dollars in people's lives? It would be a great tool to take that MP visit. Yes, that information exists. You may want to look at the Homeless Hub at Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, or look at the Mental Health Commission of Canada at Home Chez Soi project. And last question. for today. How do you get the money directly to the homeless person if they don't have a postal address to send it to? Usually that is done with through connection to organizations they may be working with. So often a person experiencing homelessness on their way into housing is helped to get a bank account, to get that information lined up. They can work on their address through, there's a bunch of different ways depending on where you live. But you can often use the facility or the organization you're working with as your address. But the work of getting people connected to income supports and the way, for example, this benefit could be used in a way that, for example, the agency could pay the first and last month's rent in order to get the address, and then the benefit could be paid directly to the individual once they're in the unit. It varies province to provinces, but there's lots of different ways to make that work. So I am going to stop there. Thank you all for all of your questions. Thank you all for coming. I did want to thank you all for having such a lively chat going on. I'm trying to keep one eye on the chat as well. Really do appreciate your engagement and your questions and your involvement. But as I said, at the end of the day, governments will do what voters allow them to do, or governments will do what voters demand they do. And so it's really important, and we really need your help in, sending letters to MPs, sending letters to, sending in op-eds to your local newspaper, reaching out to your neighbors and to your friends and getting them to do the same thing, making phone calls to your members of parliament. All of that makes a ton of difference in this process. Also want to thank Nik Nanos and his team for responding really quickly to our request, getting the polling done really quickly, getting the data turned around to us, and being there for us and helping us carry this message on to others who we know listen very carefully to what Nik has to say. Thank you all. I hope you all have a fantastic day and a great rest of the week. Thank you for your engagement. Homelessness as we see it today, is getting worse, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. We know it doesn't have to be that way. We know that this is solvable, and with your help, we can change the policy that created homelessness in Canada. We can slow this and stop this new wave, and we can prevent and end homelessness in Canada. Thank you all very much. We will post a recording of this webinar shortly, and you will all hear from us soon via email. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to Matthew on my team who helped pull this together. And thank you to Nik. Thank you all.